would like to welcome everyone here today at this webinar on abortion, conscientious objection, and the law. I am not the guest speaker. I will be just moderating the webinar today. My name is Martus De Wet, and I'm an attorney from the Wet Wepener Attorneys. We are broadcasting from a cold Free State, and myself from a cold Free State, and our guest speaker will be introduced shortly by Dr. Albu van Eeden, the CEO of Doctors for Life. But just that we give perhaps a few more moments for participants to join us. A special welcome to everybody that's joining us from outside of South Africa. We have people joining us from Asia, from Europe, from the Americas, and also from a number of countries in Africa, and quite a number from Namibia. You are most welcome. We are very glad to have everyone. If you have any issues with regards to hearing us, or if you can't see us well, just send us a chat on the chat function of the webinar or on the question and answer function. Well, as we go through the webinar, there will be, you can send us your questions on the question and answer function. And after our guest speaker has presented his presentation, we will allow opportunity for questions and for Keith to respond, for our guest speaker to respond to that. So at this juncture, I think I'd like to hand over to Dr. Albu van Eeden, CEO of Doctors for Life, to introduce our guest speaker and the topic, and say whatever's on his heart, and then we'll hand over after that to our guest speaker.
Thank you very much, Martus. It's a privilege to all of us here at Doctors for Life to host this webinar. And it is a special privilege for me to welcome everybody to this webinar on abortion, conscientious objection, and the law. It's a topic across the world that's relevant. The part about the legal issues may be more relevant for South Africans, but I trust that otherwise you will all benefit from it. So I would like to welcome all the health professionals from across the world. We've got doctors. If I look at the list here of people that we have, we've got OBGYNs, GPs, pediatricians, attorneys, pastors, nurses, and quite a few other people. So we would like to warmly welcome you with us. Our guest speaker, the main person for tonight, is Advocate Keith Matthee, as you've heard. Keith was appointed as senior counsel in 2002 by President Thabo Mbeki, if I'm not mistaken. And he has been an acting judge on a few occasions, various occasions. He has also authored 3 books. We've got to know Keith through the years as a very willing servant to join in the battle, the pro-life battle across the world. He's represented us in giving us advice on pro-life issues, which we were extremely happy with. And we really felt we could identify with his approach. I didn't really have the courage to ask him because he's a busy man, but Martus told me that he is available. And of course, when I heard it, I jumped for the occasion. So Keith, we would like to welcome you. Thank you very much. Can I just mention at this point, before I hand over, we'll be having more webinars to follow, probably one by fellow expert in embryology from the University of Cape Town, a webinar on the embryological development of the unborn child. Oh, and a special word of welcome to Dr. Emmanuel from Spain, who's really worked with Doctors for Life extensively in providing an 11th hour counsel service. Doctors for Life consists and are driven by funds. So allow me to just at this stage say, friends, if you would like to, on our website, you'll see the button there where you can donate if you want to. And we'll use the funds to keep our activities going. I think that's basically it from my side, Keith, and then I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Albu. I trust everyone can hear me. I, along with Albu, am technologically challenged. So this is a new venture for me. But I trust that everyone can hear me. It's a privilege.
We hear you well, Keith, and we can see everything. So thank you.
All right, thank you. The topic, abortion, conscientious objection, and the law. And by the way, for those who wanted the PowerPoint presentation, if you want it afterwards, just ask Martus and he will send it on to you. As we can see underneath there, tonight I want to have another approach. I believe another approach is needed that requires a fundamental shift of thinking. And with this shift of thinking, I think it's germane to medical staff, but also to the wider public and the wider civil society. In terms of abortion, conscientious objection, and the law, in other words, the question that's been posed in advertising the webinar, at one level there's a simple answer, and that is that Section 15 of our Bill of Rights, read with Section 16, freedom of expression, and Section 9, right to equality of the Bill of Rights, gives everyone the right to freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, and opinion. And I'm satisfied that there will be no problem for any doctor or for any nurse who wants to conscientiously object when it comes to abortion, that they will be permitted to conscientiously object. The complication comes with Section 10(7) of the Choice of Termination of Pregnancy Act 92 of 1996. And in this presentation, I'll refer to it as the Abortion Act. It reads as follows: any person who prevents the lawful termination of a pregnancy or obstructs access to a facility for the termination of a pregnancy shall be guilty of an offense and liable on conviction to a fine or to imprisonment for a period not exceeding 10 years. And later on in this presentation, we'll see the effect of the term informed consent, also in the Abortion Act, that will have, this has a direct effect on this provision. And this provision, that's where the gray issues come in, and where one has to judge every situation on its own merits. In other words, when can it be said one is preventing an abortion? When can it be said that one is obstructing access to a facility for an abortion? And that'll have to be judged situation by situation. And Martus and I are more than willing to assist and to advise anyone who's struggling through that issue. But as will be seen later, with this different approach that I'm suggesting tonight, and particularly with the effect of informed consent, that to a large extent takes away the sting of the section 10(1)(c). But as I said this evening, I want us to approach this issue in a wholly new way, which addresses the real issue underlying the need for conscientious objection. In other words, caring for all unborn children and their mothers, and partially 10(1)(c) of the Abortion Act. Because as I understand it, underlying a conscientious objector is the desire to care for all unborn children and for their mothers. And the approach that I'm going to suggest tonight does that. A few assumptions as I continue with this presentation. The first assumption is that I've assumed that the focus of concern of all the participants is unborn children and their mothers. So not so much their own consciences, but the unborn children and their mothers. That's the focus. That's the real focus of concern of the participants. The terminology I'm going to be using essentially will be pro-life, pro-choice. The focus of concern, the assumption I make when I use the word pro-life, is that there's a concern for the child, for the unborn child, and for the mother. When it comes to pro-choice, the only concern is for the woman concerned, and not for the child. The final assumption, and this speaks specifically to doctors and nurses, is that the final reference point for medical practitioners is to do good, do no harm to human life. And that such decisions as to what is needed to ensure that they do no good, that they do good, do no harm, must be grounded in medical science. Those are the assumptions. As I said, I'm proposing a totally different approach to this issue. And it's an approach that needs a fundamental shift in one's mind. It's a shift from self. It's a shift from one's own conscience, which underpins conscientious objection, to what is best for the unborn child and for the unborn child's mother. So the concern isn't one's own conscience. The concern is for the unborn child and for the unborn child's mother. Along with this, the shift that is necessary is that what determines that concern is not rooted in religious or ideological decisions. It's not there isn't a foundation in religion or ideology, but that the decision is based in medical science. The big lie. There are many big lies in our modern society, and one of the really big lies is that the pro-choice folk, the pro-choice group, that they are not ideologically driven, and that their decisions, their concern for the woman, their propagation of abortion is rooted in medical science. And that the pro-life group is not rooted in medical science, but is rooted in religion and in ideology. Let me give some illustrations about why this is a big lie. Martus and I have been asked to help some doctors and nurses in a hospital in the Western Cape. And flowing from that, we've obtained a copy of the Western Cape Health Department circular on guidelines and protocols on abortion And central to these guidelines is its reliance on what's called the best practice on abortions of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And the reference is on your screen if you want to have a look at the paper. I just want to look at some illustrations that illustrates this big lie. It claims to be based on, quote, the latest evidence-based clinical practices. Yet in it, the authors assert as a fact, as a medical scientific fact, that it is a myth, and that's a word they use, that there are, quote, proven associations between induced abortions and subsequent psychological problems. So they say it's a myth that there are any proven associations between elective abortions and subsequent psychological problems. Let's compare this with Professor Coleman, one of the leading experts in this field. She's Professor of Human Development and Family Studies at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. She writes as follows: my review offers the largest quantitative estimate of mental health risks associated with abortion available in the world. The sample consisted of 22 studies, 36 measures of effect, and 877,297 participants, 163,880 of whom experienced an abortion. Results revealed that women who aborted compared to women who had not experienced an 81% increased risk for mental health problems. When compared specifically to unintended pregnancies delivered, abortions were associated with a 55% increased risk of mental health problems. She then highlights some. Anxiety disorders, 34%. Depression, 37%. Alcohol abuse, 110%. And suicide behavior, 155%. She concludes, the scientific evidence linking abortion to increased rates of mental health problems is published in leading peer-reviewed journals in psychology and medicine. And her full overview and her CV can be obtained on my website that's on the screen. Now, if we just for a moment pause, the British obstetricians and gynecologists, backed by and used by the Western Cape Health Department, say it is a myth. It is a myth that there are long-term emotional and psychological problems attached to an elective abortion. If one has regard to Professor Coleman's review, one can see it is not a myth, it's a medical fact that there are there's a significant risk of long-term psychological and emotional damage to a woman who chooses an abortion. A second example. Sorry, I'm just trying to get myself on the screen, but I keep on just getting Martus, so you're going to have to be satisfied with Martus, because otherwise the screen is covered up. A second example to illustrate this big lie. Underlying the circular used by the Western Cape Health Department is that, quote, abortion is safer than childbirth. In fact, this is expressly stated on 2 occasions in that paper. Whilst in science, when it comes to the physical well-being of the mother, this assertion is arguable, Professor Coleman's survey of the literature specifically shows that this is not the case when it comes to psychological and emotional consequences. In this regard, it's of particular interest that in the same paper, best practice paper, under staff support, there's the following provision. confidential access to professional counseling should be made available to personnel assisting in abortions in need of it. The question must be asked, why might there be such a need? Especially as, according to the circular itself, all that is being done is removing products from the pregnant woman, and that it is a myth that there are adverse psychological effects to the woman having an abortion. A third example of this lie. When referring to the unborn child, he or she is referred to as products. The Abortion Act refers to the unborn child as the contents of a woman's uterus. The obvious question that occurs to one is, if the unborn child is no more than the contents of a woman's uterus or products, why is there a need to distinguish between the first, second, and third trimester? Indeed, why is there a need for the Abortion Act in the first place? Why can the mother not remove the products from her in the 39th week if she decides having a child is inconvenient? For example, there's not an act controlling the removal of a woman's tonsils, which also is a product in her body. But more compelling to illustrate the lie of this assertion that all we're dealing with are products is the evidence of Dr. Wharton, Chris Wharton, and I think that's the embryologist that Dr. Van Eeden referred to, that will be giving a webinar at a later stage. He has taught anatomy, embryology, and neuroscience to UCT's medical students for many years, written 2 manuals, both of which are in fact used in the teaching of embryology to UCT medical students. He writes as follows: the information relating to embryonic and fetal development has been very well established for many years and is not a matter of the latest research. And those words are telling. It's simply not an issue for any controversy. It's not an issue that requires any further research. It's been well established for many years. And what has been well established? Biologically, the life of an independent human organism begins at the time of fertilization, conception. At this time, its genetic code is set, and as a consequence, its future physical characteristics are defined with precision. Clearly, the organism will develop enormously over the subsequent months and years, but there is no event during development which fundamentally changes it from a non-human organism to a human organism. Various times or events of developments have been used to attempt to define the initiation of human personhood for various practical reasons. But the life of the organism is one seamless, continuous process. We may debate philosophically or legally her or his status, but it is entirely reasonable for a person seeing such a fetus to regard him or her as a small human being. In my experience, that is a normal response to seeing such a fetus. And his full report is also available on my website. Now I want to just show a 44-second fetoscopy of an unborn child. As Dr. Wharton writes, when you see something like that, in his experience, the normal response is that you're seeing a human being. And for the non-medical people, that little one is only 9 weeks old. Clearly describing what we've just seen as products, or as the contents of a woman's uterus, is not rooted in medical science, but in ideology. And regarding the unborn child as a patient to whom good must be done and no harm must be done is firmly rooted in medical science, not in religious or ideological conviction. Of course, this medical science illustrates the veracity of the holy books of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam when it comes to the fact that from conception, we are dealing with the human life. What's the impact of this approach with this mind shift, where the shift of mind from focusing on our right to conscientiously objecting to what the science says and what our the medical imperative of do good, do no harm to all human life, that be the focus. What is this mind shift? What is the impact of this mind shift when it comes to defending the unborn child and her mother, and in the process, assuaging our consciences? As an example, as I said, Martus and I have been asked to advise some doctors and nurses in a hospital in the Western Cape. And we went to consult with them. And the question put to us was, what were their rights to conscientious objections? Because pressure was being put on them to be co-opted to participate in elective abortions. After consulting with them, we prepared a letter to be sent to those in charge at the hospital. And on request, once again to Martus, that letter can be sent to anyone who might be interested. If the approach set out in that letter by us, if that can be rolled out throughout South Africa and indeed in any neighboring countries as needed, it could have a huge impact. Let me just pause and very briefly deal with the thinking in the letter, which involves basically a two-pronged approach. And it's linked to what I've already spoken about, the need for a change of mindset and the focus on do good, do no harm, and that whatever decision we take, doctors take, nurses take, it must be rooted in medical science and not in ideology. The first thing is to use the Abortion Act creatively. Now, most of us must probably have a real intense hatred of the Abortion Act, but what I'm suggesting, and with this change of mindset, is one can use the Abortion Act creatively to help unborn children, to help their mothers. And the first example is the use of the requirement informed consent. And in the letter that I spoke of, we set out the case that we rely on. It's a 2002 case that describes what is required for this informed consent in terms of the Abortion Act. And in a nutshell, the judge says knowledge, appreciation, and consent is required. And the judge emphasizes that there must be substance, there must be substantial knowledge, appreciation, and consent, not just lip service. When it comes to the doctor or midwife satisfying themselves that all three are present. Because the judge found that if all three are not present, then performing an abortion is unlawful. We also see in the judgment that there's an additional onus on the nurse and on the doctor when it comes to satisfying themselves that a girl child's consent is informed. These requirements, and I don't have the time to go into great depth, but the requirements of knowledge, appreciation, and consent would at the very least require the pregnant woman to be informed concerning the evidence, for example, of Dr. Wharton, including, there'd be nothing stopping the doctor or the nurse, including a visual presentation of an unborn child, the age of her child, so that she can be fully informed of what she is doing. She can have full knowledge, full appreciation, so that she can consent. The lie is, if one looks at the Western Cape Health Department circular and the British obstetricians and gynecologists, is that she's told by omission or commission that all that is happening is that products are being taken out of her. That all that's been done is that the contents of her uterus is being removed. There's, in terms of informed consent, in terms of the Abortion Act, in terms of medical science, she needs to be told and she needs to be shown what is inside her, and particularly the age of the child. And there's lots of visual presentations of children at different ages. The pro-choice folk will cry foul on this. But clearly then they're being patronizing to women. They're not allowing them to make an informed decision. So that's the first thing that one is entitled as a doctor and as a nurse to share with the person who comes for an abortion. The second one is the evidence of Professor Coleman, is to caution the woman that there's a significant risk, a very significant risk of long-term emotional and psychological risks attendant to her decision. At the moment, doctors and nurses, for example, in the Western Cape, they can hide behind the circular sent out by the Western Cape Health Department, which refers to unborn babies as products and says as a fact that it is a myth that there are psychological effects attached to an elective abortion. Crucial is to take that defense away from doctors and nurses. And that's what we've done in the letter. We've told the authorities of the particular hospital that in any further future conduct in this matter, because we sent them the report of Dr. Wharton, we sent them the report of Professor Coleman, we will assume that they had full knowledge of that evidence. And they can't simply hide behind a circular that professes to be scientific, but is simply driving a specific ideology. Another example is in the Act, there's a responsibility on the medical practitioner in the second trimester to satisfy himself that, quote, the continued pregnancy would significantly affect the social or economic circumstances of the woman. And from my experience in the second trimester, this is the main reason that is forwarded for an abortion. Now, once again, if one applies the Act, firstly, a doctor and a nurse must say to themselves, they simply don't have the expertise to make this decision. They would have to call in an expert who can give evidence or can give input as to whether or not the continued pregnancy would significantly affect the social or economic circumstances of the woman. They simply don't have the necessary expertise to make that call. And if the state doesn't supply the necessary expertise, then they're acting contrary to the Act if they go ahead with the abortion, because they haven't satisfied themselves that the continued pregnancy will significantly affect the social or economic circumstances of the woman. Thus, refusing to perform the abortion before this evidence is presented would simply be complying with the Abortion Act. A further example, Section 4 of the Abortion Act specifically talks about the provision of counseling before and after an abortion. In the light of the expert medical evidence of Professor Coleman, this must be a major concern for medical practitioners and nurses when assessing medically what is in the best interests of the pregnant woman. And if such counseling is not available before or after an abortion, clearly medically it will not be in the best interests of the woman, having regard to Professor Coleman's evidence of the long-term emotional psychological effects, to go ahead with the abortion. And in terms of the act, they cannot continue with the abortion. A further example is the ethical duty to examine a patient and remain in a professional relationship with her from the outset until the abortion is completed, where medication is prescribed. Martus and I found in this particular hospital and the surrounding clinics, what gets done is that almost a pro forma script is signed by a doctor that's sent out to clinics, and the doctor is prescribing medication to begin the whole abortion process without ever consulting or seeing the patient. Now, not only is that unlawful, but it's profoundly medically unethical. And particularly when you prescribe a drug, and one of the drugs that's used is contraindicated for pregnant women, there's a particular responsibility medically in terms of the ethics of the situation on you to make sure you stay in a relationship with that patient up until the end of the process. This simply doesn't happen. Now, complying with the substance of the various provisions I've just dealt with, and the ethical and legal requirements when prescribing and dispensing drugs, will present significant logistical problems to the present conveyor belt approach to abortion, which is built on a foundation which has no regard to the substance of significant requirements of the Abortion Act, the need for informed consent, the need for counseling, and the others that I've mentioned, and the ethical and legal requirements of prescribing and dispensing of drugs. The second leg in the letter was to emphasize the ethical imperative for all doctors to do good and to do no harm to all human life. It's crucial if that is used as the reference point combined with medical science, as I've already covered. The ethical requirement to do good, do no harm to all human life puts one in a far stronger position to help unborn children, to help their mothers, than if you're simply relying on the right to conscientious objection. This do good, do no harm reference point must be combined with a position rooted in medical science, that unborn children are human life, and thus a doctor or nurse has two patients when dealing with a pregnant woman. That central to consent being informed is that the mother is made fully aware of the development of the child within her, and that the mother must be apprised of the medical fact that there are significant emotional and psychological risks attached to an elective abortion before she makes a decision. And those would all be consistent with the imperative, the medical, ethical imperative to do good, do no harm as a reference point. And yeah, it must be emphasized that because something is lawful does not make it medically ethical, nor does it mean it's rooted in medical science. It is unethical of a doctor nurse to hand over, and one of the very significant practical consequences of this approach is that it then becomes unethical for a doctor or nurse to hand a patient over to a doctor or nurse who simply grounds their decision in their own personal ideology or what the law permits or requires, without them first using medical science and medical ethics as their reference point. So with this approach, there will in fact be a reversal of the argument against conscientious objectors that they, and this is in the Western Cape Circular, they say under conscientious objectors that they mustn't put their spiritual interests ahead of the patient's health or other interests. There will be a reversal of that. And in fact, it's the pro-choice doctors, the pro-choice nurses who will make themselves guilty of unethical conduct and indeed unlawful conduct in not complying with the act. We just need to look at Nazi Germany and the atrocities committed by doctors under that Nazi regime. And it simply wasn't a defense to say, well, the law required what they were doing. That simply is not the reference point for a doctor. The reference point for a doctor and a nurse is to do good, do no harm, and to make a decision about that that is rooted in medical science, not in ideology. What would the outcome of this approach be? The effect of such an approach, if rolled out throughout South Africa and indeed neighboring countries, will be far-reaching for unborn babies and their mothers. The conveyor, it will have a huge effect on the conveyor belt approach to abortion. If just this hospital that Martus and I have been trying to assist, and the system that they describe, it's a conveyor belt. And no compliance with the act, no compliance with the requirements to do good, do no harm, no requirements with what the science, the medical science is in the situation. It relies on simply paying lip service. And if nurses and doctors started applying this approach that I'm suggesting, it will have a massive effect in slowing down that conveyor belt. Furthermore, in effect, we will be achieving the same and far more than if we merely conscientiously objected. And just to say, and I put it there in brackets, that Martus and I are available to help at no charge. And we're prepared to go anywhere in the country and to advise, because one has to look at the unique situation of every situation. And all we would ask is that if there are any travel or accommodation costs that be covered. But we do not charge any professional fees for our input when it comes to this issue. Crucial for this approach, if it's going to work, if it's going to start, if the momentum is going to start, courageous doctors and nurses and others who are prepared to sacrifice in defense of the most defenseless in our society, the unborn child, and of course their mothers. I refer to others as there's a need for wider society to galvanize and organize homes and caring facilities, and thankfully there are many such places in the country for these mothers in crisis, so that when they go to hospitals and clinics, and when nurses and doctors apply the act and apply do good, do no harm, they can in fact refer them to such homes and caring facilities as a viable alternative to abortion. In this regard, I've written a book on the whole issue of abortion. The Emperor Has No Clothing. It's also available on my website at no charge. And in chapter 16, I specifically deal with this aspect. Before we go on to questions, in conclusion, as I prepared for this webinar, I worked out that as from the 26th of March, that's when COVID first struck our shores, until the 30th of June, some 2 days ago, 2,657 people have died in South Africa from COVID-related causes. Many of these were elderly people and people with comorbidities. In the same period, using the average official figures, some 42,750 unborn babies have been intentionally killed in South Africa by doctors and nurses at the behest of their moms. This reality simply has not featured on the radar of the leadership of the medical and nursing professions, churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, and the wider civil society. Reflecting on this before COVID-19, I ended my book, The Emperor Has No Clothing, as follows. As a nation, we will be well advised to heed the words of Professor Forsten in his review on the film Downfall, which exposes the evil of Adolf Hitler. The true form of evil rarely looks evil on the surface. It seduces us with fair face, as it leads sometimes an entire nation into damnation. Thanks, Martus. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Keith. Thank you for that very, very insightful presentation. I think the fundamental shift from weighing up the doctor's rights as opposed to the women asking for the abortion's rights, the shift from that to the issue of where the doctor has two patients, I think that is very significant. That is very important, I think, and that's central to what you've said. I think just before we go to some of the questions, which we will be answering shortly, and please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, we'll be dealing with it now. I just want to give Dr. Albu van Eeden an opportunity if there's anything that you wish to clarify. We do not see you, Dr. Albu, but I think we can hear you.
Thank you, Martus. Yes, allow me to just congratulate and Keith Matthee on a fantastic presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well. We just don't see you.
Okay. I think I see this as a spark, or I hope this presentation to be a spark that will spread across the country and be able to light a huge fire, which is so desperately needed amongst health professionals. Our student nurses and student doctors are bombarded through their studies with the pro-choice side of the argument. And I think what we need is we need momentum. We need larger amount of the quiet majority who are uncomfortable with performing abortions to get this information and to start holding hands. And of course, I would like to say that in the process, we have been and we would like to continue holding hands with fellow pro-lifers abroad. I just want to, from a practical point of view, explain something that we've met up with. And maybe it would be good, we are open for suggestions from all of you who will be listening. But the situation that many doctors and nurses are faced with in hospitals in South Africa is abortion tablets are handed out at clinics or at hospitals where there are not sufficient doctors and pro-choice staff that are willing to provide a 24/7 service for these people. Now, part of the strategy of the pro-choice lobby, and through the years also in Nazi Germany and also in South Africa, is to break the abortion procedure up in small pieces. And so no health professional needs to do the whole procedure from beginning to end. They just need you to be willing to perform a small part of the procedure. And you know, you can't really, according to them, feel guilty that you've been performing an abortion. You were just doing a little bit here where you were expected to do. But as it was said during the Nuremberg trial, after the hearing of the doctors, Nazi doctors, it was all these people willing to do their small bits that kept the massive machinery of the government going. So you can find an excuse and say, yeah, but you know, I haven't really performed the abortion. I've only prepared the bed. I've only prepared the patient for theater. I've only given the anesthetic. I've only done the D&C and so forth and so forth. And then at the end, I just take care of the patient. And some of the sections which you will be expected to perform are, humanitarianly speaking, pretty solid and pretty good. But the fact is your part make this whole system continue to function and continue to go forward. So the policy that Doctors for Life have suggested to people who have come to us, and as I say, we're open to suggestions from you, is you had a pro-life doctor or nurse on duty in the hospital, and in the hospital, they're after hours on call. Somebody else gives the patient the abortion pill. The patient comes in bleeding. Now, what is your duty? The approach that we've had up till now is stabilize the patient. That is your ethical obligation. You cannot just let the patient lie and bleed to death. Stabilize the patient and do what is necessary to get the patient hemodynamically stable. Once you've done that, the patient should be passed on the next morning to pro-abortion staff who can complete the second part of the abortion procedure for them. Because this is what's happening now. They are forcing pro-life staff they initiate the first part of the procedure, and pro-life staff are forced to complete the second part of the abortion procedure for them. And so this is the suggestions we've had. But we would like to get input from you on this matter. Thank you, Martus.
Martus, can I just reply to one or two things that Albu has said?
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
In terms of the last point, as I said, the Doctors for Life got Martus and I just to advise this, because that's particularly, Albu, what happened at this hospital, as you know, piece by piece, and then they expect people to come in at a later stage. One of the things I would suggest, and it's consistent with the approach that I'm suggesting, is that we have to start becoming proactive. And when decisions are taken that are not rooted in science, medical science, when decisions are taken that are not driven by do good, do no harm to all human life, we then have to lay charges with the Medical and Dental Council. Because up till now, it's only conscientious objectors who've had to face charges against them. And I think for me, part of it is just to put pressure, and perhaps we need to start with one hospital. And perhaps the Medical and Dental Council, they won't do anything with the charges, but we simply have to persist to reverse the pressure. Because, and linked to that is, and what I hope to do tonight as well, particularly for the doctors and the nurses, is when we conscientiously object, there's a sense where we are meek, where we're not totally confident that our position is rooted in medical science. And our position is rooted in medical science. And I would ask, even for us to become more empowered, to become more proactive, and not to be apologetic. When we conscientiously object, there's sort of, we're told, and particularly at this hospital, they were told, well, we must now, it's a tough time and you can't put your conscience ahead of what the woman wants. But if it's rooted in medical science, if it's rooted in medical ethics, then all of a sudden we can become far more proactive and confident. And we don't have to be apologetic about our position, because science backs us. And that's the lie, is that science doesn't back us, but science does back our position. So I almost would like to change the description pro-life to those who make this medical ethical decisions rooted in medical science. So that to take ideology completely out of it, that they can't use that to bang us over their heads. Just some thoughts.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Keith. Thank you, Dr. Albu. going to just try to deal with some of the questions that's come in. Some of them are perhaps more of a medical nature, and we can see if we can deal with them. But I'd like to start with this one. The question is, have you heard of anecdotes where doctors are forced to perform abortions, including, for example, asked not to go into obs and gynae where they have ethical concerns? And this would be speaking, as I understand the question, would speaking to the issue where it might be said to somebody that you're not fit for obstetrics and gynecology because you have because of what you believe. And yeah, I think I'll leave the answer to you on that one, Keith.
Well, that, you know, I tried to touch on that in my. The reality is that the pro-life position is rooted in science, and the pro-choice is not. I use the two obvious examples of that the unborn child is human life. That's no longer contentious. And number two, Professor Coleman has clearly shown that, you know, the long-term adverse psychological and emotional consequences to the woman. So the pro-life position is the one that's rooted in science. The other one is rooted in a myth that there's no impact, or that they're dealing with products and the contents of the woman's uterus and not with the human being. So I would just encourage folk, once again, be confident. Science is on our side. Medical ethics is on our side. And we must become more confident about that, humbly confident about that.
And that would, what you're saying, Keith, is that when we say we are relying on science is on our side, medical ethics is on our side, we are also saying that it's therefore a defendable position. It's therefore why we as lawyers can also defend you on that basis, that you've acted scientifically rather than you acted according to your conscience. Obviously, the two tie in, as you've said, but the emphasis is that you as a doctor or a nurse are acting scientifically, and therefore you cannot be barred from going to obstetrics and gynecology because your position is not unscientific.
Martus, a very good illustration, if I can just use it, is you and I and Dr. Albu are involved in defending a young doctor who tried to convince a girl who was 19 weeks pregnant not to have the little one killed. We've reached the stage where we've submitted the report of Dr. Wharton and Professor Coleman as our expert witnesses. You and I both know that the Medical and Dental Council representative has not in any way challenged their evidence. And they haven't challenged it because they can't challenge it. So there's a practical demonstration that we've put it out there, the evidence of Dr. Wharton and Professor Coleman, and it hasn't been challenged. That's going to go through unchallenged. And that's the reality, because they're not going to find people who can contradict those two. So yes, sorry, Albu, you were going to say?
Yeah, no, I just want to get clarity, Keith and Martus. In order to be proactive, is there room for handing out letters or forms to staff that are working at a hospital who are pro-life of conviction, to fill in these forms and sign them and inform their employer ahead of time that these are my convictions and we respect that you will not expect of me to take part in any form of the part of the abortion procedure?
I would, as I say, if we can go hospital by hospital and then look at the unique situation of each hospital, but I would rather inform the authorities at the hospital that we are doctors, and as such we are only driven by what is required to do good, do no harm, and what is rooted in medical science. And when it comes to the unborn child, it's very clear the medical science is the unborn child is human life, and part of the medical ethic is to do good, do no harm to all human life. So I wouldn't emphasize my religious or my ideological belief. I would simply, because that's, so I would agree with you, but I would frame it, and that's what we've tried to do in that letter, Albu. I think you've seen it. And,
Yes.
and you know, Martus, anyone who wants to see that, please, just ask Martus and he could send it on, where we set out an approach. And we'd have to fine tune it for each situation, each hospital. But I think the basic approach in that letter will deal, Albu, with what you're raising. And I think we can, with confidence. And in fact, I just don't think they're simply not going to be able to, you know, they work, the bigger the lie, the more somehow people are intimidated by it. They either believe it or they're intimidated by it. And so many of us in the pro-life have allowed ourselves to be intimidated. So we go into a corner and we say, right, well, that's my religious belief. Medical science is on our side. Medical ethics is on our side. And we need to go out there, and particularly if we're concerned about the unborn child, you know, and 500 little ones were killed today in our country, and more, 500 tomorrow again, and their mothers, then we need to start taking off our gloves and use science, which is on our side.
I agree, 100%.
Keith,
So letters like that would be great. If we could be approached, I'll be, Martus and I, we're more than willing to actually go. It's better to consult with the group in the particular area. As I say, Martus and I don't charge for our professional services. And then we can then tailor-make a letter which we can then send on behalf of nurses and doctors at the particular hospital or at the clinics.
Good.
Keith, there's a question that relates to counseling, that it's only, that it's non-mandatory counseling in terms of the Abortion Act. Would you like to comment on the approach when we adopt this mind shift that you're speaking of? What can a doctor do or a nurse do, and what not, especially in view of the approach that you are sharing with us?
Well, the Act, what the Act is saying is you can't force the woman or the girl to have counseling. That's the effect of it. What this approach that I'm suggesting is there has to be counseling for the woman to make a decision whether she wants counseling or not. So if there's no provision, and the reality is, as once again, that where we went, this hospital where we trying to help them, there's simply no provision for counseling pre or post. So if there's no provision, one can't actually even ask the woman, do you want counseling? Because you know, as a doctor, as a nurse, there is no counseling. So I would say that either you simply say, look, I can't go ahead with the abortion because the Act can't be complied with. This woman is going to need, and particularly because I know about Professor Coleman's evidence, I know that there's these long-term effects. I know that unless there's counseling, the option is given to her, and remember, the focus of that court case is substance. It's no use just paying lip service. But alternatively, I suspect most women, if you ask them, will want counseling before. And remember, it's not only before an abortion, it's after an abortion. That's where Professor Coleman's evidence is so crucial, because her evidence is about the long-term emotional and psychological effects of an elective abortion. So if you as a doctor, if you want to, ethically speaking, you have to do what's in the best interest of your patient. And the one patient is the woman. And you know that there will be long-term emotional or there's a significant risk of long-term emotional and psychological damage to this woman. And you know that she's in a place where she will get no counseling. She's going to be left on her own. I would argue that in terms of the Act, you cannot go ahead and do the abortion, that you're not then complying with the Act. And certainly I would feel comfortable to defend the doctor who makes that choice. You see what, it's not his or her conscience. They're making a decision what's in the best interests of their patient. In this case, the woman. You know there's no counseling in the area where you are. So if, say, she has an abortion, you know of this research by Professor Coleman. How can you, as a doctor, doing good, do no harm to your patient, go ahead and perform the abortion, knowing that she's, for the next 30, 40 years, in terms of Professor Coleman, she's going to have an increased risk of depression, increased rate of alcoholism, increased rate of suicide. How can you do that as a doctor? If your reference point is to do good, do no harm, linked with what medical science is saying. So from a counseling point of view, all it means is you can't force them. So if there is a place and there is counseling, and you offer it to them and they say no, you can't force them, then I would say, right, then you need to shift to the other leg, and that is that, right, that deals with the woman, but now you've got another patient, the unborn child. And you've got an ethical responsibility to the unborn child as well. So what I'm saying is if we can become more empowered, the nurses and the doctors and those of us who support them, we can slow this conveyor belt that Albu spoke about, because it is a conveyor belt, significantly. And you know, if we can reduce 500 to 300 or even 400 a day, that's wonderful. So in terms of the counseling, I think it can be used far more. We can use that to stop this conveyor belt or to slow it down. And you see, crucial, there has to be a stick as well. So the nurse and the doctor who go ahead, they need a complaint laid against them. They need to be warned that if they simply go ahead and give the tablet and not recognizing the need for informed consent, not recognizing the need that there must be provision of counseling and the other things are highlighted, then an ethical complaint must be laid against them with the medical and dental council. And we have to do that week by week by week. And even if they don't pursue it, it's pressure, and then it's going to make them think the next time. Because remember, we're trying to slow the process down, trying to slow this conveyor belt down. And I think we could do far more. But then, you know, Albu and Martus, we've spoken about this before. I just cannot understand the churches, the synagogues, the mosques, it's just somehow, you know, 2,500 people die of COVID and everything comes to a stop. But in the process, 42,000 little ones have been killed and we've said nothing about it. If we could get the conviction of what's happening, the evil that's happening, I think there are lots of creative opportunities to slow that conveyor belt down completely, including the issue of counseling, the absence of counseling. Sorry, a long answer to a short question.
Thank you, Keith. There's another question here. When standing in front of an abortion facility while protesting or informing clients, how could one make sure that you don't breach the section of the law saying that one shouldn't obstruct access to an abortion facility? I know it's not directly related to perhaps conscientious objection, but could you perhaps give a few pointers on that?
I suppose it's going to have to be judged situation by situation, but the only way you would obstruct, I presume, is if you try and stop them going in. But if if you're on the other side of the street and you, I don't know if you can, what would be wonderful is if you can project that 44-second fetus copy that I showed, and just keep on showing it all day, so that the women can see, because women really mostly don't actually grasp. And, you know, they've been given this lie that it's simply getting rid of products. I don't see why that obstructs or hinders. I would think, you know, it's if you physically try and stop. or if you heard abuse, and obviously we don't want to be part of anything like that. But it would be situation by situation, Martus. But I think we can be far bolder than we have been.
Yes.
Long as we're driven by love and humility.
Keith, another question here is, well, the person thanks you here for an excellent legal opinion on this conscientious medical debate. And then the psychological effects of 500 abortions a day should result in a tsunami of psychological cases. According to your arguments, do you have evidence of such phenomenon? You can comment on it. I don't know if Dr. Albu would also like to comment on it. I think to some degree, just from my side, Dr. Coleman's or Professor Coleman's report or research points to exactly that, but I'll leave the answer to you and Dr. Albu on this one.
Obviously that sort of research will be impossible to do. But when I was a judge in 2004, one of my acting stints, I did 7 consecutive rapes of girls under 7 in the Eastern Cape. I presided over that. And I got to the 7th, and I just couldn't understand what had happened to the Eastern Cape society that produced a Nelson Mandela, that produced a Tia Sorga, what has happened to the society? What has happened to society where life is just worth nothing? Where, in the first part of my practice as an advocate, you would just go and the murders would just be rampant. The abuse of women, the violence in our society is just quite overwhelming. And I certainly linked that. And that's why I gave the quote at the end from Professor Forsten about the evil, that a society that is simply silent about the daily intentional killing of 450 to 500 unborn children must have a brutalizing effect. And I think any of us who live in this country, we can see the effect. We live in a brutal society, and how do you explain that? And so I obviously can't prove it, but what I do know is that we live in a brutal society where life simply doesn't matter, where life is cheap, and then in my mind it must be linked to a society where people like that had abortions and the effects on them and on the fathers. I just think we see it around us every day. We're living in a desperately unhappy society, desperately broken society. But I can't prove that, obviously.
Thank you, Keith. I think we basically have 2 more questions left. The one is, do we have statistics or research showing the mother's response once she's seen a sonar of their baby prior to an abortion? And the other one is there a Born Alive Act in South Africa?
I'm not aware of a Born Alive Act.
No, and neither.
Yeah, sorry, Albu.
No, neither am I, Martus, and actually that's a point of grave concern to us, because some of our patients and some of my patients have come back from the hospital reporting about babies accidentally born alive after a failed abortion that was not given the care they needed to receive. I think our health system is overburdened, and to a certain extent, nobody really takes care of how often this happens and how common this actually is. But I think there is definitely a need for that. I knew there are regulations. I know in the Western Cape, they have regulations as to the age of the baby and his chances of surviving, certain things that must be done. The patient must, the baby must get comfort care, must be kept warm in an incubator, etc., etc. At least, even if he doesn't have a good chance of survival, that you don't just leave him in the sluice room, to lie in the sluice room and cry until he finally perishes. And I think there's a real big need for that. So I think this has basically brought us to the end of the seminar. Martus has indicated that the battery of his computer has gone flat. But Keith, I don't know whether you have any closing comments?
Albu, if I could just say that in terms of the slide is showing that. If anyone wants that, they can just ask Martus for that, and he can send it on. The draft letter that we put together for that one hospital that I believe can be used as a template for other situations, although one would have to just go and consult and then just adapt it to the particular situation. That also they could just ask Martus for that, and he will send that on to them. And it's become apparent, and Albu, you know where I stand. We stand in the same position on this. It's one of the great burdens for me for us as a country, particularly for me as a Christian with a church, but not only for Christians, that the leadership is just overwhelmingly silent, and these are the most vulnerable of all of our people. And until we start addressing ourselves to this real evil that is happening on a daily basis, I just can't see us turning the corner as a country. But we need courageous doctors, we need courageous nurses. It's not easy. And I would just, what I've tried to do tonight is just to empower, particularly doctors and nurses, and just to remind them that they don't have to go into a corner and rely on conscientious objection. They can rely on medical science. They can rely on an ethic that goes back all the way to the Hippocratic oath of doing good, doing no evil. It's only of late that some are now, that hasn't included looking after unborn children. But for Albu, you'll know, for what, about 2,500 years, it covered unborn children.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Back.
Oh, you're back.
Yes.
Yes, Martus.
Hi, Stoff. Nice to see you there. One of my Eastern Cape friends. Great to see that you were part of it, Stoff.
I see there's a raised hand from Stoff. I'm not sure if he's wanting to ask a question, but I think you can feel free to do it in the Q&A. Although I think we must wrap it up. We're almost an hour and a half. Keith, there's one question that is also very important for me, and I think to perhaps ask in conclusion, and then you and Dr. Albu van Eeden can just maybe make any closing remarks if you like. The person is asking, what can I as an individual, not a medical worker, do to fight abortion? And I thought having quite a number of non-medical people on this webinar as well, is there anything that you'd like to say on this? And also Dr. Albu, as we conclude this webinar.
Thanks, Martus. In the last chapter of our book, There's No Clothing, I touched on this. There's some wonderful folk throughout the country who've got centers going, got homes going, that 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 give alternatives to desperate women. And I think one of the best things that folk can do is to find out if there's such a place where they are, and to go and give their full support. And if there isn't, whether it's be through their church or through anything else, is to try and motivate to start such a place, so that desperate women really have got a place to come. And when they go for an abortion, and doctors and nurses say to them, look, there are alternatives, and they're able to name the alternative in the local town, that's wonderful. Because I suspect most women, if they're given that alternative, and if it's a real alternative, they won't have the abortion. So my encouragement is to roll up their sleeves and find out if there's something like that in your area. And if not, step out in faith and start something, and get a hold of something. Albu will be able to, and you, I think Martus will be able to put you onto folk who run wonderful places like that. And even if you just start small, but just take that first step. So for me, it's no use. That's more important to me than protesting, is to provide an option for these women, a viable option to abortion, practical option, and to love them. And even if they have the abortion, part of their provision is to then care for them post the abortion, because that's what the gospel requires.
Thank you, Martus. If I can come in, and let me just invite everybody. You are welcome to join us at Doctors for Life through the website. When you fill in the form to join, you'll be asked the question whether you're a health professional or not, a medical doctor, specialty, or just a friend of Doctors for Life, through which we coordinate all these different things. And then I must not forget to announce the National Alliance for Life that exists. It's a National Alliance for Life forum. It's not a specific organization. We don't have specific constitution. It's really meant to be a loose umbrella body that creates a forum where once a year, all pro-lifers from all parts of society can join together. And we have every year a National March for Life on the first Sunday of October. We'll still have to see how the COVID-19 epidemic is going to impact this march this year. But anyway, we are welcoming and inviting you to join this. And then in just closing, I just want to support Keith and say that we as doctors treat the unborn child as a patient right through pregnancy. We take care of the unborn child's well-being when you give an antibiotic for the mother for a urinary tract infection. In everything you do, all the medications you give, you do sonars, you check the well-being of the child. We even do intrauterine surgery on these children. And to be asked to turn around suddenly and blot all that out from our minds and treat the unborn child as not a patient and not a human being is just unthinkable for me. And I would agree with Keith to say those who have been maybe timid, may you be encouraged to stand up. My experience is once in a hospital, there's interpersonal relationship with staff members that come up. Some people tend to back down. We've got to be able to take a stand and keep that stand firmly. Thank you very much. And Keith, thank you very much for everything.
My privilege. Thanks, Albu, for giving me the platform.
Yes, from my side as well, thank you. I'll be displaying a slide with some contact details of Doctors for Life. You'll also be receiving an email with contact details. I see more questions, a number of questions has now come in, but feel free to direct those questions to Doctors for Life, and we'll forward them to Keith or to whoever can assist to answer them. So on that note, we say good night and enjoy the evening further, and thank you for joining us.
Martus, is it just us?